Thank you all. It's great to be here. As she said, I spent most of my time with the Air Force, but I'm very interested in Army military history as well. And most of my time overseas in Europe, I got to visit many of the battlefields for World War I and World War II. So on a personal note, that's been a focus area for me, as well as with the Air Force history. So I've been at McGuire for McGuire Dix Lakehurst now. It is the largest the largest multi-service base in the world, and definitely for the United States because we have, pretty much biggest military. And it's the only place where you have Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, United States Air Force Reserve, U.S. Army Reserve, Army Guard, and Marine Reserve. So there's no other place where you have so many different organizations at one place. And as a historian there, we have to expand beyond just the Air Force because of the wide heritage that we are exposed to every day. So again, it's a pleasure for me to be here, and I titled this lecture From Here to Over There, because the main job of Camp Dix was to get soldiers prepared to head overseas for the war. And that's been its main mission for every war since World War I. So we know that Congress had declared war on April 6, 1917. At the time, though, the Army only could call upon 31 active divisions and 100 guard divisions. And those are soldiers that amounted to about 213,000, almost 214,000 soldiers that America could call on to send overseas. This is at a time when they would lose that many people in the afternoon on the Western Front. So it was a big demand for the Army to build up. And the way they did that was to set up these camps. So General Pershing visited France, and he talked to the British and the French to get an idea of what they had as far as manpower in their divisions. And what he found was that the American version of a division was too small. There weren't enough men. And more than that, he was not willing to just have our soldiers get fed piecemeal into the grinder of sitting in trenches on the Western Front. So he wanted a supersized division that had enough power to push out of the trenches and to go forward to take the battle to the enemy and to move the war to its close conclusion. So when he came back to America, he developed a plan that he would have, each division would be composed of 17,666 riflemen. There would be, 26 machine gun companies, which the machine gun was still a relatively new piece of technology then, and 72 artillery pieces. So this was much bigger than what our allies had overseas. And for the initial draft, the Army called upon 687,000 men to be called up and sent to these camps that they were going to set up. And that would be 286,000 regular troops and 400 guards troops. Their ultimate goal, though, was that they would have 4 million men under arms to fight this war. And we wouldn't quite get there, but they did everything they could to get that number. So on 1 June 1917, Captain George Mulheron had 19 soldiers that were assigned to the 26th New Jersey Engineer Battalion. They arrived at Wrightstown, New Jersey, to set up what would come to be known as Camp Dix. On 12 June 1917, Major Harry C. Williams became actually the first commander of Camp Dix. There was a couple reasons why they chose Camp Dix, or that location there at Wrightstown. For one, there was a Pennsylvania Railroad spur, and I mean the company Pennsylvania Railroad, not that it was in Pennsylvania. But there was a spur right there, so a lot of different links in that area. Plus, it was close to ports. So you had New York, you had Trenton, and you had Philadelphia, which were very close. And so they could rapidly move equipment and men to that location with that railroad spur. So it was a prime location. More than that, though, that area of Wrightstown had a large amount of surface water and underground water that could be used for drinking. Water is surprisingly one thing that will kill an army faster than anything else if you don't have access to it. And it was relatively mosquito-free, which is a big deal. And as we find later on, became a really big deal that it wasn't a mosquito-infested area. So the other things that made that area good for setting up the camp. The soil mixture. It was a combination of sand and clay and gravel. So this meant that they could build buildings rapidly, and the terrain and the ground was perfect for digging up trenches to simulate what they would expect to see on the Western Front. So sand wasn't too hard to dig through. If it was harder, it would have taken more time to set up those trenches, the practice trenches, basically, that they were going to fight through. And Camp Dix was actually just one of 13 camps that were established by the War Department to train the soldiers. And to begin, they started out with a lease of 5,000 acres of land from the local farmers. And then they also leased out a weapons range. So on 18 July 1917, they actually named the site Camp Dix. Up until this point, it was just getting built. There wasn't a real designation. They named it after Major General John Adams Dix. Now, he was from Massachusetts, so you may be disappointed since you were New Jerseyans, I imagine. But he had a very good pedigree, and he fought in the War of 1812, and he also fought in the Civil War. Beyond that, when the wars were done, he was a U.S. Senator, he was the Secretary of the Treasury, Minister to France, and, excuse me, Governor of New York. So he had done some things, and they wanted to honor him. That's why they named it Camp Dix. So it took 11,000 workers to build the camp. And within a span of about 4 months, they erected 1,655 buildings. Now, that is impressive. They put these buildings up fast. But these were not meant to be long-term buildings. So that gives you an idea, too, of the kind of effort put into that. At the time, the workers earned an average of 60 cents an hour. So if you think about that in, say, 2017 dollars, that'd be about $12.49 an hour. They worked 8-hour days, 6 days a week. If you were an electrician or a plumber, you got a little bit more, 62.5 cents. I don't know how you get the half cents, but that's what they got. And this was at a time when the average yearly income was about $875. So it was good money for those people that were getting to work and build the base, especially if you had those skills. And they built one of the largest hospitals in the world at the time. This hospital had 2,000 beds, which was almost unheard of for a hospital to be that large. And they had the capacity to train 65,000 to 70,000 troops per, basically they would send them in as a division at a time. So they could manage a division and some other cats and dog units to train at the same time. So the camp was finished on 4 September 1917. So this picture here shows a general layout of the camp at that time. It cost them $13 million. And again, if you think about how much that is today, that'd be a little over $229 million. If you think about how much it costs to build a base today, I think they still got a good deal. I think that's fair to say. But you can see, in a span of just 4 months, they've outlined what is going to be something that would establish the base for 100 years in the future, which they obviously were not thinking about at the time. So the first unit to arrive was the 78th Infantry Division, and they came to the camp on 27 August 1917. So the camp hadn't even been fully built yet before they arrived there. And they were the Lightning Division, and I noticed in the cabinet over here, they have the artifacts from someone who served in the Lightning Division. You can actually see that flash there in that display, which is great. The first commander of the 78th was Major General Chase W. Kennedy. He was also the first commanding general of the base. So he ran the base as well as the division, getting them ready to go. The 78th was allocated primarily from people who were from the Northeast coast. So there were 1,202 recruits from Delaware. There were 20,665 from New Jersey and 21,160 who were from New York. So these were the men that composed the 78th Division, Infantry Division. They trained at the camp until May of 1918, and then that's when they were sent over to France to begin their war. There were other units that trained at Camp Dix, though. There's the 87th and the 34th Infantry Divisions that were trained there. There was a 349th and 350th Field Artillery Battalion. They were a part of the 167th Field Artillery Brigades. And there was the 15th New York Regiment, which was federalized because they were a Guard infantry regiment, to become the 369th Infantry. And they actually fell under the 93rd Division. So they were apart from all the other individuals or all the other units, but they trained here. And they actually went over to France in December 1917, a little bit before the 78th, where they earned the nickname the Harlem Hellfighters, which you probably know them more as. So the units that fell under the 92nd Division, the 349th and the 350th, those were actually the Negro units. So they were the second largest unit that was at Camp Dix, behind the 78th. So I just want to run down what a typical, say, training day was like for the soldiers as they were coming in. Well, recruits really, because many of these men did not have prior military service at this point. Some may have fought in the Spanish-American War or things like that. But for the most part, as I said, the United States purposely kept the Army small. And this was the first really big expanse since the Civil War. So they would do close order drill, calisthenics. They would march and do bivouacs, which is a fancy name for camping, staying out under the stars and tents. They did field inspection, so that's when they rank everyone and they're lined up, and then they walk through and tell you haven't shaved and your weapon's dirty. They would go to the range for firing. Lots of time going to the range for firing. Usually lots of marching to get to the range to do the firing. And then they would do bayonet drills and defense and attack of set trenches. So next I'm going to show you just a few pictures to give you an idea of what it looked like for these men. So here they are getting set for some training with the gas mask. And this may just be me. I have no firm data to prove this, but if you look at the people, especially the tall guy in the middle, the shoulders, I don't think they're smiling in that picture. It looks to me like all of their shoulders are just sunk down. So they don't look happy to me, but that's just me. I don't know for sure. It's another picture of them in the trenches, same happy expressions. And a bottom picture there on the right, the bayonet drills. So you just had to make sure your partner was not nearsighted, and they could make sure the bayonet went to the side of you and not into you. Another shot of them digging the trenches, where I'm sure they probably did, but did not appreciate that it was clay and not firm rock that they had to dig out there. And I can tell you from experience, it is very soft ground on base. Here, they're practicing to hide as trees from the Germans. Okay, no, they're not. Actually, I snuck this in because I just find it funny. These are actually troops that were training to be communications experts at University of Massachusetts. So they're climbing up there to practice stringing the telephone or telewires and things like that. So, but interesting photo nonetheless. Okay, there are other visitors that went through the base. There were lots of British, French, and Scottish soldiers that came to Camp Dix specifically to teach the Americans how to operate with tanks, how to fight against them, and how to attack and defend those trenches. There was one period where they actually had quite a few Italian soldiers that were on base because they were cut off from Italy and had to circumnavigate the world basically to come through Camp Dix to get back on the other side to help push the Germans out of their country. So, but there was a lot of foreign guest hosts at Camp Dix at the time. So again, the typical day for the recruits. I told you about the schedule of events that they would participate in. So this would start at 5:45 in the morning. They would wake up, have to be in formation by 6 a.m. They have breakfast by 6:20. And for those who manage the horses, there would be a stable call at 7 a.m. After the stable call, there would be drill at 7:20 a.m., a slight break from 11:30 to 1300. Now, this is time where they could eat, maybe go to the sick call if they had to go to the doctor, take care of those foot sores from all the marching. And they would reconvene at 5 p.m. for retreat and dinner. In between that time, from 1300 to 5, they would do more training, maybe repeats of the morning, and go into more detail on just jobs of being a soldier. So this is interesting, something I found out. After they had retreat at 5:35, then they would also offer classes in the evening from 7 to 8:30. So if you needed help with writing or money or these other things that you couldn't get in your civilian life, they gave you the opportunity to attend classes for self-improvement. And you imagine after this hard day, wearing the gas mask, running, shooting, and it's like, yeah, I want to learn English, how to write, how to read. But they did it, and that part was mainly voluntary. And then they would have taps at 10 p.m., and that's when lights were out. And they had to go to bed and wake up at 5:45 next morning to repeat all of that. And this was for 6 days a week. So Sunday was the only rest day when they were in training. At first, when they came, they didn't even have enough uniforms for all of the soldiers to train, so they had to actually train in their civilian clothes. Now, again, I've gone through basic training a long time ago, but I couldn't imagine subjecting my personal clothes to what I had to go through in basic training. And no, we're not giving any money for that. So, but they had to do that. And this is a time when you had maybe 2 sets of clothes, 3 if you're lucky. They had a quartermaster report that talks about the supplies that were available on hand for clothing. They had 614 pairs of shoes, 47,340 cotton undershirts, 39,350 cotton stockings, 24,600 wool stockings. So this is what they had in 1917 when the first troops started to arrive. So what's it like to be that 615th person and not getting your shoes? Must have been hard. The first weapons that the men trained with were actually handoffs or cast-offs from the Spanish-American War. Eventually, as the divisions ramped up and they got more supplies, they would be issued the 1903 Springfield rifle. And everyone would get that before they shipped overseas or shortly after they got there for that first division. So Camp Dix, as you saw from the outline I gave you, or the map, it was very big, even with that 5,000 acres. They crammed a lot in there to start. So it operated as its own self-contained city for the most part. So they had a hospital. They had a fire department. There was their own sawmill. They had stables, their own police force, bakery, and, as I mentioned before, the train station. So they didn't need anything from the surrounding community. Everything was on base. But providing for the troops consumed a lot of material and a lot of time from the Quartermaster Corps. So again, in 1917, the reports from the Quartermaster Corps show that they have food stocks that included 135,000 rations of bacon, 169,000 rations of corned beef, 1,135,000 pounds of sugar, and 2,575,000 pounds of salt. So, cholesterol was not a thing they checked back in those days. You didn't have to worry about that. But that's a lot. And that's something that they would go through all the time. So here you see the fire department and the band. Luckily, they had the bands attached to the divisions that would come through, but they would play music for the troops as well as learning what calls they needed for the formations. Here you see that stable call at 7. Like, what stable call? This is what they did at stable call. He's shaving the horse. And if you go to the Dix portion of the base today, they have that very machine in their museum. Or I guess here for you all. So that machine is in the museum. Very interesting. There are their master cooks and nurse. So I told you that hospital was big. It was staffed by 104 officers, 650 enlisted men, and 158 nurses. And that was for normal operations. Sleeping quarters. This is actually an idealized picture for the postcard. This is what it was supposed to look like and what people expected when they got there. Often it was much closer company. So there's a note I read by a Private Vernum, and he was complaining to his family that they made them actually put their beds closer and sleep head to foot. And his big concern was that his bunkmates' feet were perilously close to his nose, and he wasn't sure about his hygiene standards. So, but ideally, that's what it would look like before all the troops finally came in. So at this time, it's also important to note, in World War II, you hear a lot about the USO. Well, before that, there was no service organization set up for the soldiers. All these extra services had to be provided by civilian agencies because the Army just really, they did not care. You came to train and get on the boat and go to France. That was it. So civil organizations took it upon themselves to set up things on camp, and the Army would allow that. So there was a YMCA, YWCA. The Knights of Columbus ran an auditorium. They did set up a Liberty Theater so they could have shows. There was a Red Cross building, a swimming pool, library. Someone had set up a dramatics club, and they had 3 newspapers. Content all looked the same to me from what I saw, but hey, they had 3. The YMCA maintained 9 huts and an auditorium. And if you could see that map, obviously you can't sitting out there, but they were spread throughout the camp. So wherever groups of soldiers were at, they wouldn't have far to go before they could find a hut for the Y. There was also a Jewish welfare organization building and Christian Scientist facility. There were 2 hostess houses for the Negro troops because they obviously couldn't use the other places until they turned one of them into an officers club. But that's what they had. The Army also actually employed a full-time camp song instructor. Interesting choice from the Army. An athletic director and a boxing director, which you can understand fits more in line. And then women from the Suffrage Association ran a soldiers club, and there they distributed socks and sweaters and comfort kits to the soldiers and encouraged them not to go off base and imbibe when they got really tired of being on training. The YWCA had a building that was built, and you probably say, like, YWCA, it's all men there. Why would you have that? Well, on that Sunday that they had off, their wives, girlfriends, sisters, mothers would come and see them, and they could go to the YWCA huts as a kind of joint meeting place. So it gave them a place to go. Here's a picture of some of the 2 of the newspapers and the official Camp Dix Songbook. Unfortunately, I didn't have any of the songs in there just to cover, but it exists. They had songs for the camp. There was a prohibition on troops going anywhere in the 5-mile radius outside of the camp. Again, to discourage them from partaking of things that would distract them from training to kill people. So, how effective that was? But it was there. There was a prohibition against it. As you see the soldiers going to the saloon there. But I talked before about the mosquitoes. Well, that became a bit fortuitous because in 1918, the influenza epidemic that was sweeping through Europe came to Camp Dix. It's believed that a soldier that had returned from Europe had the flu, and it quickly spread to 675,000 people in America died from the flu in this epidemic. In New Jersey, there were 22,000 people who died from the epidemic. Part of that is due to, let's say, people not following the standard protocols at the time. So on October 5th, the State Board of Health ordered the closure of churches, theaters, movie houses, dance halls, saloons, and any other public gathering place. But the Newark mayor, Charles P. Gillen, said that he believed that alcohol actually cured the flu. So he forbid the saloons from closing on the exception that they could only sell liquor by the bottle. They had to hold it out the window or out the door of the establishment, and they had to have a note from their doctor. So there was a lot of complaining about this, but what they think is one of the end results is that over 10% of the deaths from the flu in New Jersey actually were all there in Newark. So you can close the churches, but don't touch the saloon. So Camp Dix was quarantined, and at one point, that base hospital I told you was set up for 2,000 people actually had 7,943 patients at one time. So a lot. And they had to actually spill over into 18 barracks that were there for the troops that were supposed to be training. Major Elbert Clark, Chief of Lab Services at Camp Dix, recorded that there were 6,500 cases of flu and 800 deaths. Now, if you research this, you'll get wild numbers. I saw as high as 12,000 cases, 900 deaths, and as low as 3,400. So there's a lot of different things out there. But I read the report from the person that was actually there at the time, and that's what he said. So the troops did deploy. That was what their mission was. That's why they were there at Camp Dix. The 78th Division, when they arrived in France, they trained with the British and Flanders, Belgium, but they trained the British for 2.5 months before they joined the 1st U.S. Army. They participated in the Saint-Mihiel, Meuse-Argonne, and Lorraine operations over there. The division ultimately suffered 45 deaths. There is one story of Private Raymond Schroth. You may have heard this again. I'm new to New Jersey, but he attacked a machine gun nest on his own with Germans. He wound up capturing 20 Germans, marched them back to Allied lines single-handedly. And what made this even more remarkable was that all he had was a pistol that was out of bullets. But the Germans didn't know that at the time. He just fought so fiercely. Then the 369th, they arrived, and they were immediately sent to do manual labor. So they worked as stevedores at the Brest port. But eventually, they convinced Pershing to let them go and fight with the French. So they were attached to the French, completely out of the American chain of command. But they participated in the Meuse-Argonne offensive and captured the town of Ripon. And they also fought at Metz, Champagne, or Champagne if you prefer, Bois, Friehaut, and they went through those campaigns on the line. Two of their members, Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts, Johnson was from New York, Needham Roberts was actually from Trenton. They were the first Americans to actually earn the French Croix de Guerre medal for battle. They were sitting at a listening post, and they heard some scuffling noises where the Germans were trying to cut the barbed wire to sneak past their lines to get onto the Allied side. Roberts and Johnson threw every grenade they had, expended every bullet they had before they came face to face with the Germans, and they used bolo knives, which they had traded with French forces, to fight hand to hand. And Johnson actually killed 2 Germans that were trying to drag off Roberts to interrogate or whatever they were going to do with them. But the 369th served 191 days on the front line, which was 5 times longer than any other American regiment. When it was near the end of the war, there had been about 70,000 men from New Jersey that had been called up into arms. So when peace was declared on 11 November 1918, it did actually catch the Americans by surprise. So at the time, they had one person in the Army that was planning for how we would get rid of all these troops that we've just built up from 200 and some thousand to over 1 million in a short period of time. So Colonel C.H. Conrad Jr. was the man that was given this task. He had been given the job 1 month prior to the armistice. Needless to say, he didn't have much of a plan. So they went about how would be the best way to do this. They thought, oh, maybe it's first in, first out. You got called up first, you get relieved first. Or some kind of point system, which is similar to what they did in World War II. They eventually decided that they would just demobilize whole units. One unit would get demobilized at that time, and whoever was in it, no matter when they came in. And that's what was their plan. And so they actually started demobilizing people within a week of the armistice. At Camp Dix, the 34th Infantry was still, I'm sorry, not 35th or 34th, the 87th was in the midst of their training to go over. And so they started to get some of them demobilized right away. Demobilization included physical exams for the troops. They had a lot of paperwork that you would expect. Property inventory, which is always critical when you have large amounts of people leaving with a lot of equipment that costs a lot of money. So they would make sure they got back as much of that as they can. And again, we see in the case back there, they did a really good job of securing all that stuff. So the soldiers that were coming back, in order to keep them entertained or busy before they can get out, they would send them to the Mexican border to patrol. They would man ports of embarkation. They would go to convalescent and demobilization centers and pretty much just act as guards to make sure things were going well. And they filled out the supply depots and hospitals as extra orderlies or moving all this equipment that was coming back. So the 78th Division, they returned to the U.S. on 6 June 1919. And eventually at Camp Dix, 7 entire infantry divisions were inactivated between January to June 1919. And 300,000 men had gone through those gates by 31 July 1919. So once the process was underway, once they figured out what they were going to do with these troops, they could take a person, bring them to a place like Camp Dix to muster them out, and within 48 hours, they would be civilian again, which is pretty quick. It's not that fast today. But after this, Camp Dix was placed in caretaker status in 1926. So that time from when the war ended to 1926, they had a small contingent of military on base, but it was more or less just a free-for-all. So civilians would cross through the area. They would do whatever they wanted. The buildings were starting to become dilapidated. I read one instance where a bus was speeding through the area at that ungodly speed of 25 miles per hour. And he hit an Army mule, and he actually sued the government for $12 for how much it would cost to get his vehicle fixed. So the Army countersued for $126, which was the price of the mule. But in 1933, then they set up the Civilian Conservation Corps, and they came and started taking care of the base. And that was really what helped solidify that they were going to keep Camp Dix. It would then be Fort Dix and go on and on and on for every war after that, training our troops. But that concludes my speech or briefing. And thank you.